Today on Inspired Money.
It would seem to me that although we in Europe and in the West, we are automatically configured to think that what really matters is what goes on in New York, in Manhattan, in LA, in Washington, and what happens here in Europe is about Berlin and Paris and Rome and so on. Actually, I think the really big decisions that present challenges as well, these are not just opportunities for us, challenges too, really increasingly take place in Beijing, in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Islamabad, in Delhi. You know, it's how do leaders in these countries with massive populations, in some cases massive resources, what decisions are they trying to make and how will they affect all of us?
This is episode 89 with Professor of Global History at Oxford University and author of The New Silk Roads, Peter Frankopan. Welcome to Inspired Money. My name is Andy Wong, a managing partner at Runnymede Capital Management. Each week, we bring you an interesting person to help you get inspired, shift your perspectives on money, and achieve incredible things. From making it to giving it away, Inspired Money means making a difference, creating something bigger than oneself, and maybe, just maybe, making the world a better place. Thank you for joining me. Hey, Inspired Moneymaker. Welcome back. If it's your first time listening, welcome. Inspired Money is different from other personal finance podcasts because we don't want to just learn how to live with money. We want to help each other to live richer lives, make a greater impact, and together, make the world a better place. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. It's one that I've really been looking forward to. The world is changing. All roads used to lead to Rome. Now they lead to Beijing, says today's guest, Peter Frankopan. Peter's the best-selling author of The Silk Roads, and he has a new visionary book about the dramatic and profound changes taking place in our world today. He writes from the perspective of the rising powers of the East. He wants us to put aside our preconceptions and see the world from a new and ultimately hopeful perspective. Whether you're an investor, leading a business, or an employee, it's important to understand global megatrends so that you have the best chance of positioning yourself to benefit in the future. In this episode, you'll learn why curiosity may be the most important skill. You'll learn about China's Belt and Road Initiative, also known as BRI, what it is, what to keep your eyes on related to it, and why you should care. And then positioning yourself for the future by keeping an open mind toward learning about other cultures. And it's not just reading books and visiting museums. You can start just by listening to global music. So I hope that you learn a lot from this discussion. Now let's get inspired with Peter Frankopan. Peter, welcome to Inspired Money. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Hi there. Well, thank you for getting in touch.
Absolutely. Let's jump right in. What's your earliest childhood memory of money?
Well, I grew up in Europe and here until very recently, every single country had its own different currency. And I remember every summer we used to go to Sweden where we'd race to our bedrooms. My grandmother lived there. And on our bed, we'd have waiting for us some candy, a magazine, a cartoon magazine, a comic, and then 50 Swedish crowns. Which would be today around about $7 or $8, I guess. At that time, that was the only way we got pocket money. My parents didn't give us weekly cash, as I think is much more usual these days. But I remember admiring the fact that, well, first, that I felt like I was rich. Second, that I was free to spend my money however I wanted. But also, the thing that I think really sparked me, and is still part of the work that I do, is that people put different values on different things. You know, why it is that we all have different languages, different hairstyles, different eye colors, different fashions, but why we have different ways of measuring how we think value should be ascribed. I remember thinking that at an early age, how amazing it is that all these different countries all had their own currency. So I think my first memory of money was very closely connected to travel and to sort of bigger questions about why is it that, you know, Europe's not an enormous place size-wise, but why is it that each country you hop and skip to had its own different denomination? They'd have different colors. They'd use different images on the front and back of their banknotes. And that was a source of both mystery to me, but also real curiosity of thinking, how do we buy and sell things? It's fascinating.
That is fascinating. It sounds like you had a very curious mind early on, so no surprise that just continued to grow.
Well, I definitely was brought up in a household where we were encouraged to read. But I've got kids of my own, and I know that's sometimes easier said than done. I think children can be very creative when they don't want to do what their parents tell them to do. And I think we were no different. But what was great about growing up is that I'm one of five children, and we were always encouraged to ask each other questions. And I guess because there were quite a lot of us, things could sometimes kick off a little bit between us, asking questions about the meaning of life and so on. But we were left on our own, and I think that creativity of being incredibly bored is quite a useful thing for kids to do. But curiosity, I think, can be taught. It's a funny thing. I mean, and I'm completely off point and off message straight away, Andy. Is that in our education system we tend to over prioritize memory skills. We tend to teaching young people to solve problems in a sort of set way, and actually curiosity is the most important skill to teach a child or a grown up. It's how do you see the world and how do you try to find a way of explaining that. So I was lucky in that respect for sure.
Interesting. And in you saying that, I hear the boredom being an important component. Like you have to have just quiet downtime to allow some of that curiosity and things to grow, right?
I guess. I mean, you'll be able to find lots of experts who specialize in trying to understand and explain curiosity and boredom. And I suppose a bit like somebody who stops themselves having that last donut after a meal. You have the evangelism of someone who's been through it, who's convinced that that's what saved them. The fact that being bored is somehow part of the recipe to success later on in life. I mean, I think luck and timing play such an important feature of it as well. But I think that time is that. I mean, I definitely think that as I am now older, the greatest luxury I have that one wants is stuff that money really can't buy, and that's time. It's having the ability to either switch off or to be able to press stop, or not feel that there are deadlines or commitments coming towards you. And I think as a child, that's the greatest luxury. You've got no concept of, I guess you might think how long you might live. You were aware of that early on, and you see people getting older, and your parents seem unbelievably old when you're a 10-year-old. But there are no limits to where you have to be or when, and it's great to have that sense of drift. It's when you get older you realize that you're like a hamster on one of those wheels running round and round and round, and it's quite hard to sometimes get off the wheel or the conveyor belt of life.
Well, hopefully we're all getting wiser. Well, let's talk a little bit about your new book, The New Silk Roads, The Present and Future of the World. It's a follow-up to your best-selling book, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World. What's the relationship between the two?
So I'm a historian. I'm professor of global history at Oxford University, and my job is to try to understand the past better, and we do that from having more and more sophisticated ways of how we read literary sources. How do we understand archaeology and new archaeological discoveries? How do we start to use new types of evidence that come from climate data, for example, or from medicine? One of the most interesting things that I was involved with was a project looking at we understand now post-traumatic stress disorder much better because of the military's experience in the last 20, 30, 40 decades. What happens to men and women, servicemen and women who are under fire or under intense pressure in the field, and try to relate that back to how we can better understand things like the Crusades or knights or people fighting in the past or in antiquity, where we don't have the same level of medical material, but that these ways in which we can understand the past better is the sort of bread and butter of what I do and what I love doing. The book that I wrote on the Silk Roads more or less came up to the present day. It was published in 2015, and I was incredibly lucky to be one of those rare books that went viral. And I was speaking to my publishers last year, and I said, look, I'd quite like to bring things up to date, because since the book came out, it seems to me that a lot has changed. You in the States, you've had the election of President Trump, and what feels like a very divided country between Democrat and Republican, and the disengaged. Of course, that's important too. Here in Europe, we have the challenges of Brexit to the UK, but also all sorts of problems bubbling under the bonnet about migration, about identity, about the future of Europe and the European Union. And then looking further east into the world that I really work on, Russia doesn't look like it's changed because there's President Putin still involved at the top. But Russia is at the point of a major inflection point of having moving its dependency from its raw materials and so on away from Europe onto China. Last July, in fact, was the first time that Russia has exported more gas to China than it ever has to Europe. It's a big change and a big shift. And then the role and the rise of China is something which is on the front page of the newspapers everywhere at the moment, about how to engage with China, how to better understand what's going on. And then the other parts of the world, I look at Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, South Asia, India, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. These are all, a lot has been happening in the last 3 years. So I said to my publisher, I'd quite like to write a new last chapter, and they were thrilled by that. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought, it's quite hard to condense this all into a short, pithy, 12, 15-page new conclusion. So I said, I'd quite like to write a longer book that explains what some of these big themes are, that tries to explain that there is a connection between the election of Trump and Trump's international foreign policy with these other parts of the world. And we're not always very good, I think, at seeing the big picture. We're quite good at breaking things down as scholars, as journalists, as commentators into smaller parts. And my publishers, they let me get on with it. So the New Silk Roads is a sort of follow-up, explained what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, and tries to say that the things that really matter going forwards for all of us globally, of course, climate and migration. Those are things that I think well known. But it's what exactly is China after? What is the relationship that the US does and could or should have with China? What's this reconfiguration of China's Belt and Road? What does that mean for countries across not just Central Asia and across Asia altogether, but there are very important Chinese commitments, obligations, contracts, investments into and loans into sub-Saharan Africa, even into the Caribbean and South America. And so how do we try to understand the world of today and tomorrow? And it would seem to me that although we in Europe and in the West, we are automatically configured to think that what really matters is what goes on in New York, in Manhattan, in LA, in Washington. And what happens here in Europe is about Berlin and Paris and Rome and so on. Actually, I think the really big decisions that present challenges as well, these are not just opportunities for us, challenges too, really increasingly take place in Beijing, in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Islamabad, in Delhi. It's how do leaders in these countries with massive populations, in some cases massive resources, what decisions are they trying to make and how will they affect all of us? And the decisions that are being made have already global consequences. And I think it's important for us to sometimes step away from the mirror where we're good at admiring our own reflection and to see the world in from the bigger perspective.
Well, I'm so excited to have you on the show to discuss some of these changes and trends that you see taking place. I'm also excited to talk to you because I saw on Twitter that you've got some famous fans. One example is singer Belinda Carlisle.
I love Belinda Carlisle. I love Belinda. I met her when she was last over here in the UK, and I think she's terrific. The wonderful thing about how interconnected we all are is that if you're on Twitter and social media, people can find you straight away. I mean, you know that better than me, Andy. And it's a wonderful tool to be able to connect. And in fact, it shows how globalized. I was in Peru. I've got just trying to look at things going on in South America, and I logged onto Twitter and I saw Belinda was tweeting saying, "God, I'm reading this amazing book," and then she mentioned my book and my name, and I connected straight back and said, "Oh my God, I fainted." And no, she's great, and in fact, I've got to know her a bit, and I admire her hugely, both for her music, but she's also a very vocal environmental campaigner and for human and civic rights, social rights. So Belinda is one of my new friends, and I'm a fan of hers, and I still have to sort of sit down when I think that she might, on a good day, maybe if she's listening, she'd agree that she's a fan of mine. But no, wonderful, really. She sounds to be a big fan. Well, she's great. Heaven being a place on earth. That was part of my youth, and I didn't waste my youth. I was pretty studious and diligent. But it's a wonderful thing when people can connect. And in fact, I do love the medium of Twitter, whether you're famous or not famous. The exchanges that you get from fellow scholars, from Joe Public, who reads your book and asks a question. I've had that this week of someone asked me about the types of engines being used by SpaceX. And I learn a lot from the way in which information is offered up, exchanged, traded, or not traded, I guess, offered up, given away, where people in the big sitting or living room of the world are able to share their ideas. So it's a wonderful thing for a scholar, where we sometimes behave like the priesthood, where we sit in our libraries and we talk only in the sort of musty lecture rooms of great universities in the world, and we retain what we do. We don't do that always on purpose, but Twitter's a great opportunity to share some of the research, some of the ideas we have. So Belinda's one of my was become a friend. It's who'd have thought that when I set out to write about the Silk Roads.
That is fantastic, and to Belinda's credit, I mean I think it's kind of surprising to many that it's like the singer of the Go-Go's. Today, as a musician, as an artist, she is very forward-thinking. I mean, part of her reading your book is because she understands the changes that are taking place. In your book, you write, "We are living through a transformation and a shift that is epical in its scale and character." And you make a point that what we perceive important in the West, things that garner our attention, is often missing the huge megatrend taking place in the East.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think we are conditioned to think we know what normal means, and that relies very heavily on our kind of memories of the past, whether they're reliable or not. I mean, here in Britain, our concepts of even the last 20 or 30 years, it's very easy to cherry pick all the good bits and not the bad, but by and large, most Western societies have become more forward thinking. That doesn't mean that prejudice, persecution, intolerance have gone away. But, there's, I think, across the board, things are better than they were 20 or 30 years ago. And we want to always bank those things that we think have come in our favor, and sort of ignore the things that have gone in the other direction. And I suppose one of those is the fact that, well, look, in the last 20 or 30 years, the big shift globally has been enormous in terms of what's been going on in Asia. And I think in the case of China illustrates that very well. We've sort of suddenly woken up in the last year to try and to realize that, well, look, here's a state that doesn't look or behave like ours. It doesn't seem to want to look or behave like ours either. And yet it's got a seat at the top table. And how we tried to deal with and work through with China, it comes as it's a sort of new game to try to work out. And that's partly because in the last 30 years we haven't watched what's been going on. So since 1990, for example, China has, according to the World Bank, brought 800 million people out of the poverty line. There's a final 10 million to go. The president of China earlier this year has talked about how that needs to be done by 2020. And the poverty line, it's a notional line. It's a notional number of how much a daily wage should be and what you can pay with that. But that is very progressive compared to inequalities in Western worlds, where the numbers of those sleeping homeless on the streets of London or New York or LA every day, and the number of kids growing up in food poverty, it's a shockingly high number, and it's a number that it's rising. So right now in the USA, according to independent estimates, something like 20% of kids are suffering from food malnutrition and food poverty. And that's an amazing story that we see shifts going in what we think look like different ways. And so even in sort of very basic ways of how we see the world, the major soccer teams here in the UK, when I was growing up, there was no question. All the players would be local. They'd all come from their hometown, and they'd all have owners who'd made good, who came from Liverpool or Birmingham or London. And today, the great teams across the whole of Europe have owners that don't. And it's not just a story about China, of course. My own team, I'm a Chelsea fan. Our team is owned by a Russian billionaire whose money comes from minerals and resources from Siberia. In fact, he doesn't have a visa now to get into the UK, so he hasn't been to watch Chelsea for a while because these are complicated times with Russia. All the professional teams in Birmingham, which is Britain's second city, the UK's second city, all the 4 or 5 professional teams have Chinese owners. The owner of the champions of our country, soccer-wise, are owned by the Abu Dhabi royal family, and in France, the best team in France by miles, owned by the Qatari royal family. And I think that these shifts and these anecdotal bits of data, they sort of think you can wake up and think, well, okay, that sounds sort of persuasive, but actually we then start to drill into who's buying the vineyards, who's buying the real estate, who's buying the art. Where are these kind of shifts and drives coming from? And the people who are the wealth that's being generated in the world is all primarily, a large part of it is being driven by what's happening in Asia. China's part of that story, 2 new billionaires every month in China, but also to do with the success of states like Singapore, of Vietnam, that over the last 15 years, its rate of growth has accelerated it beyond all recognition. In fact, the transformation, Vietnam now gaining on a place in the world's largest economies. But in the last decade, not one single one of the world's fastest growing economies is located in the Western Hemisphere. And that's partly to do with, in some cases, low starting points. It's partly, in some cases, to do with high levels of investment that maybe can't be sustainable. But when you're a historian, the first questions you always ask when you're trying to look at centers of power is which resources matter and who controls them. Second, who controls the networks that allow those resources to be exploited? And then, of course, demographics play a third role, as does climate, etc. So climate security and environmental security too. And, we start to see a world in a very different kind of way where, even in the last year, the 10 biggest buildings put up around the world, 9 of them are in China or in Asia. You see the levels of growth of the economy in places like in India and Pakistan, where countries that don't often get a lot of attention apart from within the military and geopolitical context. But, these are massive populations, Pakistan with 200 million people, India with 1 billion plus, that these shifts are pinned by fundamental roots, fundamental causes, fundamental drivers. And, energy is obviously a big part of that, and the fossil world we live in. But what's going to replace the fossil fuels, but we hope so we don't all burn to death, are rare earth. So all of our laptops and our clean batteries and the solar stuff that's going to capture into these clean batteries. And 95% of the world's commodities are either located in China or Central Asia or controlled by Chinese entities, including things like cobalt in West Africa. And so that shift of what matters, who's got control of it, who's planning for the long term, really starts to become a real problem, where here in Europe, and I guess in the States too, that's part of the reason why there are these sort of knee-jerk reactions to try to see that there are states that pose major national security threats that seem new. But actually, a lot of these challenges have been a while coming. It's only now we've woken up and realized that we need to pedal backwards to try to work out how to deal with them.
It's interesting because I feel like in the media, especially in the United States, since that's what I'm reading most of the time, when it comes to China, usually the stories are narrow in their focus. They're about trade or they're about human rights. But you're saying that we really have to pay attention to China. And the anecdotal evidence is there because we see the changes all around us, from fashion to travel to soccer team ownership. It's there.
Yeah, I mean, so in 1990, the Chinese share of the luxury goods market worldwide was almost exactly 0%. Now it's already more than a third, and by 2025, it's predicted to be 44%. And this current 12-month cycle, Prada, the fashion group, is opening 9 stores in the city of Xi'an itself, just one city in China. The number of cities in China, which has a population of more than 1 million, there are now 150 cities in China that have populations of more than 1 million people. And, what a historian, again, will tell you is that where you have big urban environments, and this is the same for the United States too, the bigger the city, the bigger the more frequent people's exchanges are with each other. If you live in the rural Dakota or Wisconsin or wherever it is, France, and you live 20 miles away from the nearest stores, then of course your engagements are you can spend less money less often. That's partly changed by the digital world, where you can order things from whichever online company you want and they'll be delivered the next day. But cities drive global economies, and that shift of how urbanization has happened in China in particular has driven the fastest urbanization in human history. So in the 15 years before 2005, China built the equivalent over the course of 15 years of the entirety of Europe's housing stock. And that process of accelerated change changes the shape of social categorization. It builds a middle class. It displaces populations, which is, of course, a challenge, as well as bringing the good stuff about more trade. But I think that where you're exactly right, we tend to cherry pick the bits we want to talk about. And human rights in China and the trade stuff is immensely important to be both following and shaping opinions about. But it's much more complicated than all of that, because states are not either good or bad. They're always the much more nuanced and sophisticated ways that you need to be able to deal with people. And one of the big challenges, I guess, we have culturally is that we're very strong on our culture in Western Europe. You can listen to European or American music and films all around the world, but that world is changing. So I was just reading earlier this week that the rise even of just South Korean pop music in the new report released by the industry standard for the phonographic and music industry. It shows that the spread of K-pop. Well, last year there were 100 million downloads of South Korean music in Peru. There were more than 100 million downloads of South Korean music in Turkey. And you start to see Turkish bands. You start to see bands from all over, from Brazil, for example, being listened to globally. And in this globalized world, it's very easy to fall asleep at the wheel and to think that everybody just wants to have what we've got. That's the kind of default US position, I guess, because, well, the US is the global powerhouse for culture, for military, for politics, economy, and so on, for obvious reasons. But then you have the kind of the imperial disease that comes with that. It was the same in ancient Rome. It was the same in Britain in the 1900s and so on, is that you expect everyone wants to come to you and you reckon that everybody will learn your language. You don't need to spend any time thinking about other people because it's so obvious that New York is the greatest city in the world. So obvious that people want to crash through the wall or through the barriers and want to come and settle in the US. And I think it comes as a shock to see that there are other countries that are rising that perhaps don't see that the US is the natural the culmination of their destiny.
Coming up, you'll learn about the Belt and Road Initiative, the importance of natural resources, and tips for how to adapt to the new world that Peter's outlining. But first, some perspective on Donald Trump and Brexit.
In a way, Trump is quite a good symbol for that. He's not the problem himself. It's that nowadays when you travel around the world because of Trump, when you say to people, don't you think the United States offers all these wonderful models you should follow, you won't find many people today saying that the model for what they should base their state on is Trump, or quite frankly the UK, where we can't decide, are we leaving the European Union? If so, when, on what terms, on what basis, and why can't our legislators find a way of agreeing what the right course of action is? And we suddenly see that these democratic processes of trying to work out who we should choose, who we should vote for, and so on, don't always end up with an outcome that it will come through. The world keeps on spinning, regardless of how good or bad you think Trump is or how good or bad you think Brexit might be. It keeps on spinning. But the problem is that it produces this internalized discussion where all that matters to us is what's going on in the White House or what's going on in Parliament in Britain. It's the same, by the way, for Germany, France, etc., etc. But it's very hard in that process to then be spending time and resource trying to work out how we should engage with other parts of the world.
The show notes for this episode can be found at inspiredmoney.fm/089. If you're listening in your car or wherever you are, check the show notes if you want to learn more about Peter or things mentioned in this episode. It's time for the Runnymede Money Tip of the Week. This week I want to talk about active investing versus passive investing. I believe that there's space for both. Passive investing typically means investing in a broad market index like the S&P 500. It's passive because you own all 500 stocks. You're not stock picking. Rather, you're choosing to own the market, and you're doing so at a very low cost. Over time, this can serve you very well because reducing fees to a minimum can be a big win over the long term. Now, since we're talking about global and international issues today, I think that when it comes to international investing, especially in lesser developed markets, active investing can pay off. Just anecdotally, we were recently looking at passive exchange-traded funds versus actively managed strategies focused on China. It became evident that the research and active fund management, in this case, definitely adds value. That is, looking at net of fee results, the active managers performed better historically. So let this be a reminder. Don't just write off active investing entirely. Whether you're selecting investments for your 401k or personal accounts, always take a look at the historical performance and compare net of fee returns. At the end of the day, you want the best returns over time, not only the lowest fees. That's the Runnymede Money Tip of the Week. Inspired Money is brought to you by Runnymede Capital Management. We help you to plan, invest, and worry less. So what's your biggest financial challenge right now? Do you know how much you're invested internationally right now? Or do you have other financial questions? Go to inspiredmoney.fm/Andy to email me. Or even better, schedule a 15-minute call at inspiredmoney.fm/15. I'd love to talk to you about anything. Your money, the show, your 401k, whatever. I'd love to hear from you. You're listening to Inspired Money. I'm Andy Wong. Peter, China's industrialization and the economic growth that they've been able to achieve over the last 25, 30 years has been incredible. And many people today are worried about, is that sustainable? And there's often writing about worries about their credit problems and credit issues. But it's really the Silk Roads that could be like the next leg of growth for them, right? Can you paint the rosy picture that China's trying to present to their partners and to the world?
Well, okay, I think first it's important to put things in context. I mean, it's absolutely right that China's economic growth in the last 30 years has been stratospheric. And the fact that it's slowing down, it's quite hard to get real clarity around numbers exactly, but, call it 6% plus of growth. That's nothing to be sneezed at. You're exactly right that debt and the grey debt market is a significant issue that commentators follow. But one of the great beneficiaries of China's economic boom for the last 3 decades have, of course, been all of us consumers here in the West. The reason why our laptops, our flat screen TVs and so on are manufactured in China at low cost, low prices, that we've all, as consumers, been beneficiaries all over that. This is a cycle that sort of connects us all together. So it's not been that China's grown at our expense. We have had lots of benefits from all of that too. In terms of trying to work out the Belt and Road Initiative, gets a lot of coverage, a lot of criticism in the US. I think the first thing is to try to work out exactly what it is. So in 2013, President Xi gave a speech where he said, look, it was time for the countries and cultures of Asia to reconnect with the mythical Silk Roads, the sort of web of networks that allowed exchanges and of goods, of ideas, of people, and so on, right the way across Asia, and in fact, including into Africa and into Europe. And I think that the jury may not quite still be out on trying to work out what it is, but just this week, China itself has been issuing a statement to say, well, we're going to try to explain a bit better what we mean by Belt and Road, because there's been a lot of pushback about excessive levels of debt being given to some countries, and either at national level or for projects that are unsustainable. There's also a lot of pushback against China from the US that Mike Pence, amongst others, has said, and Jim Mattis, when he was Defense Secretary, talked very openly and very powerfully about how there can't just be one road and one belt, that shouldn't just be a Chinese thing. We should all be encouraging each other to exchange and trade and so on. But China definitely has multiple different motivations when you look at the BRI as a whole. One is trying to secure what China needs for itself in the long term. And some of that is to do with getting hold of the natural resources. China's quite resource poor when it comes to energy in particular. It has energy dependency that can be at least filled, possibly exceeded by Russia and Central Asia for oil and gas as China's consumption goes up. There's also overcapacity in China for things like steel and construction workers that displacing Chinese businesses or opening up new opportunities for them in other locations is quite useful for China's economies too. And so that's another motivation for China to be pushing at trying to fund Chinese businesses to do business outside China as well. And then, of course, China, I guess, has security issues, or what it thinks might be security issues going forwards. Particularly, it shares a border with Afghanistan, not a particularly big one, but China's obviously spooked about the rise of radicalization and of fundamentalism, and has had a very, very heavy crackdown on the Muslim population in Western China, the Uyghurs, over the last year or year and a half or so. And so I think there are lots of different elements to what it is that is going on. And one of the things that all of us who watch Belt and Road keep our eye out for is how much of this is being controlled directly from the center. How fair is it to talk of a single coherent policy? I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is part of China's constitution, but how much of this is being coordinated at a project-to-project level, or how much of it is sort of money following cracks into the floorboards, and where there's a demand for project finance that state banks follow through by providing it. And I think that we are probably at a point right now here in early 2019 where some of that is going to be reshaped and repackaged. Exactly how, where, why, and by whom I think all remains to be seen. But I think one of the things that is interesting is that, although the Belt and Road, these are big numbers that get punted out and mentioned by commentators, certainly we're already several hundred billions of dollars invested into infrastructure. Some put the number much higher, and also that the number will go up. I've seen estimates saying that China will eventually invest $8 trillion plus into Belt and Road projects. One of the challenges is that Asia needs a lot of, for it to keep growing, needs a lot of infrastructure in terms of roads, power plant upgrade, deep water ports being constructed, and the principle of building those is not a bad one. Always the challenge, like when you buy a house, is can you afford the mortgage? And that, I think, is where the big challenge comes in, and where there's no necessary incentive for the lender to be worrying about whether you can pay. And as we know from the global financial crisis, eventually, I think we used to say the fat lady will sing. Eventually the music stops and there's a consequence, and that's where the China debt issue becomes significant. There's no real obvious reason to lend good money to bad projects unless there's a very clear strategic need, and it doesn't need to take many of those to go wrong for the whole project to become compromised. So there was one case in Sri Lanka where a deep water port got into debt more or less before it was even finished, and the Chinese controlling company has taken a 99-year lease after it defaulted, and that has spooked, not surprisingly, countries, commentators, and those involved in Belt and Road, because that's not a great model if you overlend with an aim to get your hand on an asset that looks like it could be strategic, even if the Sri Lankan government say that it's excluding any Chinese military vessels from putting in. But 99 years, that's a long time not just in politics, that's a long time in history too. So I think that the Belt and Road, there are fundamentals that fit into this, which is if funding doesn't come from China, where exactly does it come from? Will the EBRD, that is a European Reconstruction and Development Bank, has huge specialized skills in operating in countries like the Caucasus. It's starting now into Uzbekistan, has been very positive in Kazakhstan in introducing good practices. Will multilateral organizations like that be able to work alongside Chinese investments? Will China be willing to allow that to happen? Will an administration under, let's say, a Trump or a US president that talks of America first, that does look like that means everybody else second? And to be fair, why should the US be building roads for other people on the other side of the world? Is that a role that the United States should be playing anyway? And one can't argue that that's not a perfectly reasonable question to ask. But then the challenge comes from, where does the money come from? And as I put in my book, the Prime Minister of Cambodia, he says, look, lots of people arrive in Phnom Penh with ideas about how we should run our state and how we should invest and what we should invest in. But the only people who come with ideas and with cash are the Chinese. And I think one of the challenges I think we have in the EU, in Europe, in the UK and the US is to work out what are the rules of this new game, because it's very easy to tell everyone off for how they're doing things and to flag up the dangers and problems. But are there ways in which we can be more proactive, possibly through investing ourselves, and putting money in, or through giving advisory? And, for example, 1% of US FDR, less than 1%, now goes into Africa. And at the moment, as the nominee for the head of AFRICOM, the US military command that has Africa on its watch, put it in a meeting in his deposition to the Senate earlier this week in the US. Africa is being shaped right now by Russia and China. And if the US is going to play a role in that and thinks that Russia and Chinese interests are malign or dangerous, then there has to be more to do than just trying to call out the Russians and the Chinese. There has to be more proactive way of investing in different countries. And if you don't, then are the consequences, are they long-term? Are they dangerous? And are they negative for the US? And so I think here in the West, the challenge we have is that in that changing world, we become so used to thinking that the world works in a set way. But as we become multipolar, as China and as Japan and as India and Russia and, well, even places like Iran and Saudi start to become more geopolitically active, what is the best way to be trying to keep the doors on the car? And right now, it doesn't look like we've got a particularly good or coherent line here in the West of trying to work out what our response to those kinds of questions should be.
Yeah, you mentioned that with Brexit and a U.S. administration that appears to be more protectionist and isolationist, there are all these complexities about how should the West handle or be involved from an individual level, like for the Inspired Money listener. How should he or she change thinking? Is it about potential investment opportunities? Is it maybe relocating for work? Is it needing to learn a new language? How does one adapt?
I think, well, it's all circles are so beautiful, Andy, because if you start at the top of a circle, you come back around to it. It's all about curiosity. So, I can't understand how an 18-year-old leaving school from a decent state or private educational background, certainly there's no excuse from a state background, doesn't have some knowledge of other parts of the world, doesn't know about China before the 20th century, doesn't know anything about South Asia or about the rise of Islam or about Russia, and what tends to happen, certainly in the UK, is when we do teach kids about places like Russia and China, we teach them only about Mao and the Russian Revolution and horrors, rather than about their culture and about why has China been an imperial power for 2,000 years plus, and how does, it depends exactly what one means by China, of course, but and how does that rub off? How do people learn their lessons from history in terms of how they engage with the past themselves? And that's very important in places like trying to understand characters like President Xi or Putin and others, their life experiences, what they've seen and how they've reacted to what they've seen growing up, clearly will shape how they see the world around them, including their reactions to the US. So I think listeners, the challenge for them is to visit art museums and look at other people's cultures, to try to listen to their music on Spotify, or other streaming businesses, which after all are essentially free, or you have to might listen to advert if you don't want to pay the subscription. But to try to make sense of that world around us, and I think we shouldn't do ourselves down too much in Western societies where we have the liberal values that we're very, very protective of, by and large quite successfully so. We do have a real curiosity. If you go into any museum in any major city in the US or the UK, you'll see artworks on display, normally free of charge, but to allow you to go and admire and see the beauty of what we're capable of as a species. And we're quite good at trying to explain that we shouldn't try and see each other based on our and have prejudices based on skin color, ethnicity, and so on. We're very open-minded, and it wouldn't hurt to go beyond trying to look after each other's rights, but to try to say, well, we should study each other's cultures too. And the education system needs to move faster to be able to deal with that. We need to have more textbooks and more literatures from other parts of the world that we read. And so I think that it's about all of us opening our eyes, trying to understand the complexity of the world around us, and also to recognize that none of these things we've been talking about have easy answers. And here's I guess a good question to end on, which is, we expect maybe sometimes too much of our politicians. We expect them to give, to square the circle. We expect them to have a perfectly formed answer that promises certainty. And, these are very difficult discussions to have with foreign leaders, very difficult to win people's trusts. But you can only do that if you're able to listen. And what any good scholar will tell you is that the mark of good scholarship, good history writing, is that you are able to keep an open mind. And that sometimes is difficult to do because it involves seeing other things from other people's perspective. And I think we're quite good at looking at ourselves in the mirror and wondering why people are not more like us and assuming that they always want to be.
I love that. So stay curious and keep an open mind. I like to ask all the Inspired Money guests, how do you define success?
Gosh, I think success is probably how well you sleep at night. If I think about when I'm happiest, I want to be surrounded by my family with my wife and kids, and you could put me anywhere. Ideally, it wouldn't be too cold. Ideally, the seats would be quite comfortable, and we'd have enough to eat. I think if you get past that, then anything else is a bonus. So, I think in a consumer world where success can easily be defined by how big is your house, how nice is your car, where do you last go on holiday. Sometimes, and again, being a historian probably helps focus the mind on that. We can sometimes try and think that we deserve more, or that the nitty gritty of daily life, of having a good meal and sitting down in front of the TV, that there must be more to life than that. And I think that you should enjoy it. We should all learn and remember the good times when we get there. And today I have my youngest son is reading the diary of Anne Frank and talking to him about what was happening in Europe in the 1940s. Sometimes success means staying alive, no wars, enough to eat. And we're very lucky in most parts of the world today. There are plenty of places where it's not so simple, in Yemen and South Sudan and Niger and so on. But, most people listening to this, if you're in the US, if you're anywhere in Europe, this is a pretty good time to be alive. And we should try to perhaps remember that's what being successful means. Day to day, where you're going to get to the end of it in good health and with a plate of food, that's enough for me.
Gratitude for the simple things.
Correct.
Well, thank you, Peter, for sharing your book, your research, your insights with us today. It's been truly fascinating. Can you tell the Inspired Money listener where to follow you and how to learn more about you and your work?
So I'm best place to find me is on Twitter. I'm at Peter Frankopan. I do clock in regularly and try to engage with as many followers as I can if they ask questions. I'm pretty tolerant. I much rather be praised than be criticized, but if I can take it. If there are things that I've said that aren't right or need reshaping, I'm happy to learn too.
And if you're an 80s or 90s pop star musician, then reach out to Peter as soon as possible.
Well, that's right. That's right. You never know if you're 80s and 90s, that's right in my sweet spot. So I'm always open.
I'm there too. So I hear you. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thanks a lot, Andy.
So what was your favorite Inspired Money moment? Do you feel like you just got an Oxford quality overview of current happenings in the world? I hope that you feel that you've learned something useful today. Peter's work provides a lot of perspective. He says not to get bogged down by focusing on President Trump's tweets or Brexit. There are many big things happening with China and many other countries with the Belt and Road Initiative. It could be a massive collaboration that helps Asia continue to grow. Keep your eyes open for opportunities and risks, and as Peter said, keep an open mind. I hope that there will be many Inspired Money opportunities as a result in the years to come. If that wasn't enough for you, I enjoyed hearing Peter's thoughts on money, the importance of time in your life, and gratitude. Focus on the simple things. If you had a different favorite Inspired Money moment and takeaway, let me know by posting in the private Inspired Money Makers Facebook group at inspiredmoney.fm/Facebook. That's where I share articles that I like and provide some behind-the-scenes looks into the making of the podcast. Thanks for listening. If you liked this Inspired Money episode, please share it. Share it on social media or tell a friend. Thanks again for joining me on this mission. The music you're listening to right now and all other music on today's show is by the amazing Jim Kimo West. Have an inspired week and do something that scares you, because that's where the magic happens.